Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to the episode of Cheap Shots, the series dedicated to showing you money-saving options on the wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we will show you how to quickly and cheaply paint a team of Orrus Spyre Hunters for your games of Necromunda Hive Secundus. We will paint these miniatures to a beautiful tabletop standard, and by using the techniques and materials that we suggest, we will help you save over $203.79 at the same time. So as you guys can see in this photo, we have the example of our two Orrus Spyre Hunters, as well as our Caryatid Prime. As you can see, they're done beautifully with a really crazy looking paint job. We're going to show you exactly how we did it using a handful of really cheap craft paints and some really cheap hobby materials. So with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about exactly how to paint this team up. So the very first step you'll need to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures. As you can see, I have both my Orrus Spyre Hunters fully assembled. I did it just a little bit differently though. What I decided to do is actually have them have one hand be a power talon and the other hand be a power fist, so that way I could actually choose which one I want to use if I want to upgrade later on. Same thing with their special weapons. I have one guy carrying a Volkite discharger, another guy carrying like a plasma type weapon, and then of course on their offhand they have bolt launchers. So that way I don't have to buy all new minis in order to re-outfit my Orrus Spyre Hunter with whatever I want. And of course we have the little Caryatid Prime also assembled in the middle as well. Now we're actually going to break up our Orrus Spyre Hunter team into sub-assemblies. We're going to focus on the Caryatid Prime first because he's very simple to paint up, and we're going to take care of him real quick, and then we'll move on to the Spyre Hunters afterwards. Now for your Caryatid Prime, the first thing you want to do, of course, is to prime your miniature. In this case, I use Rust-Oleum Flat White Primer. I get this material at my local Walmart. It cost me $3.99. I just give it the quick once over with the primer. Now primer actually does a couple of things. The primary focus that primer actually does is that it helps your acrylic paints to adhere to your miniature. Unfortunately, if you were to take acrylic paint and put it directly onto bare plastic, there's not enough surface tension to keep the acrylic paint to the miniature, so the slightest bit of friction will cause the paint to literally rub off your miniature, and of course ruin the end result on your model as well. So because that priming helps to kind of stop that. The second thing that primer also does too is actually has a large impact on the value of the color that you put on your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, if you're going for bright, bolder colors, you want to go with a lighter primer, as if you're going for more of a subdued or for a darker paint tone, you go with a darker primer. Now, because we're going to be doing an oil wash on these miniatures, it's going to really darken down the value of the colors that we choose. I'm going to use a white primer so that way the colors are more bold and vibrant before we do the oil wash. So the first thing we're going to paint the flesh of the Caryatid Prime, and there's actually quite a bit of it. In fact, the Caryatid Prime only wears jewelry, doesn't have any clothing or armor to speak of. So in order to get that bright blue kind of look from the miniature, we're actually going to paint it 2 thin coats of Apple Barrel's pale blue. You can get bright blue. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I just did it once over real quick and did 2 thick coats of the blue directly onto the Caryatid Prime. I did its wing as well as body, so that I have a good base coat to work off of. The next step, of course, is to work on the miniature base that it's standing on. As you can see, the Caryatid Prime is actually standing directly on top of the like a bit of concrete there, so I decided to pick down 2 thin layers of pewter gray by Apple Barrel paint. It's a nice medium gray color that works perfectly for concrete. I just do a quick 2 thin coats on that so that way we get that effect as well. And I do apologize, I forgot to take a picture of the dry brushing process, but I actually dry brushed the Caryatid Prime's flesh with some sky blue by Folk Art. That costs about 50 cents at your local Walmart as well. I just did a quick dry brushing all over the surface of the miniature, so that way it creates highlights on the miniature as well. Now what dry brushing does is actually allows the raised surface of your miniature to capture the pigment of your paint, so that way it creates the illusion of depth on your miniatures. The darker colors stay in the recesses, while the highlights or the raised surfaces of the miniature actually catch the dry brushing, creating that illusion of depth on the miniature. So now that you're done with that step, next thing I gotta do, of course, is a dry brush for the base. So the base on which this miniature is sitting on, I decided to dry brush that with some pale gray by Folk Art, cost 75 cents at my local Walmart. Just do one quick over on the concrete so that way you can capture all the texturing that's in the broken up concrete that the Caryatid Prime is resting on. And once we're done with that, we can start working on the finer details. Now, luckily for us, there's not very many details on this miniature, mainly just the jewelry as well as the eyes. So the first thing I do is I use Kiwi by Apple Barrel paint. It's a bright yellowish green color. I put 2 thin dots of it directly onto the eyes of the Caryatid Prime to make it look like its eyes are glowing in the darkness. After that, for the jewelry that it's wearing an arm bangle as well as a necklace. I picked out 2 thin layers of Deco Arts Emperor's Gold. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 65 cents. And it's a nice, bright, vibrant gold that contrasts nicely with the blue flesh of the creature. And the last thing I did, of course, I picked out the elements of reinforced rebar that's in the concrete that the Caryatid Prime is standing upon. I used 2 thin coats of gunmetal gray by Folk Art. It's a nice gunmetal silver color. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents, and just put 2 thin layers on all the exposed rebar to make it look like it's metallic. After that, I did a quick oil wash using mid-wax polyshade acrylic for my miniature. You could use Army Painter Strong Tone if you want to. I mean, it's a wonderful product, does exactly as advertised. The only problem is that the Army Painter Strong Tone costs $32 a can, whereas mid-wax polyshade emission oak only costs $6.99 and does exactly the same thing. So what I do is I take that oil wash and I paint it all over the entirety of the miniature that I want wash on. As you can see, the brightness of our paint has been muted down quite considerably. The value of that color has been brought down to a darker tone. That's the reason why we use such bright colors, as well as a white primer in the very first start of this miniature painting, so that way we can account for that darkening down. Now you will need to let this stuff dry and cure for about 24 hours. There is polyurethane inside the stain as well, so that happens that you'll have a nice hard high gloss coating on the outside of the miniature to protect it from any weathering or anything or fading, and that part's kind of nice. And while it was drying, of course, I decided to work on the base real quick. I decided to kind of go with this neon blue kind of base that was going on with this miniature. I've been kind of on this like synthwave kick as of late when it comes to my miniature painting, so I decided to kind of go with this blue neon kind of glowing base for it. So what I decided to do is I picked up the base in 2 thin layers of Folk Art's True Blue. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. It's a nice dark blue color. And then what I decided to do is to dry brush it real quick with some Dutch Aqua by Folk Art to get out a lot of those texturing that we see on the bases. That costs 75 cents at your local Walmart. At the same time, also dry brush it one more time with some Anniversary Silver by Folk Art, which also costs 75 cents as well. It's a bright silver paint. I want to kind of create this like this kind of scraped up weather look directly to the base. And then for the recesses of the miniature, I painted on 2 thin layers of Bimini Blue by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. So that way you have this kind of neon blue glowing look going on the bases. And then this is where we actually stop with the Caryatid Prime, because I decided to wait until I do the Orrus Hunters first, and then we decided to finish up the rest of them all together. So for our miniatures, we're going to prime our Spyre Hunters in bright silver paint from Rust-Oleum. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $3.99. And the reason why I decided to do that is because I want to kind of go with this metallic paint style on my Spyre Hunters. I do realize that their hunting rigs are all metallic. I want to kind of give like this really bright, high contrast, kind of semi-reflective, metallic colored paint for the miniatures. I wanted to create that effect. I mean, these guys look like motorcycles or sports bikes or even Transformers. I wanted to go with a really bright color scheme to represent the fact that these Spyre Hunters are using their rigs in designer colors, quote unquote, to make it look like something that a rich kid would want to get. So that's the reason why I decided to use the spray paint for this, because what we're going to do is we're going to use glazing in order to achieve our result for our miniatures, and we'll talk about exactly how that works out here in a second. So once you spray the entirety of your miniature in silver paint, the next thing we got to do now is start working on the flesh. So on the Orrus Spyre Hunters, we actually have 2 faces being exposed on these guys. The one on the left, I decided to paint that in Folk Art's, an Apple Barrel flesh tone. And get that at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. Just put 2 thin layers on the lower part of the face, where the face is exposed. And for the Orrus Spyre on the right hand side, I want a little bit more of a darker skin tone for that character. So I picked out his skin in 2 thin layers of Nutmeg Brand by Apple Barrel Paint. Also costs 50 cents at your local Walmart. And once both those dry, of course, we got to do a dry brush. So for the miniature that we did in normal flesh tone, I did a quick dry brush real quick with Delta Serum Coat Peaches and Cream. It's a nice pale flesh color that helps kind of create that illusion of depth on the miniature. I did a quick dry brush on the flesh color tones I did earlier with Apple Barrel Paint, and that Peaches and Cream cost 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. As for the miniature on the right hand side, the darker flesh tone, I just did a quick dry brushing real quick with some Apple Barrel Flesh, and once again catching the raised surfaces of the miniatures. And once we're done with the flesh, the next thing they need to work on are on the undersuits that these guys are wearing. So even though these guys are installed in these giant robotic cybernetic hunting rigs, though, they are actually wearing clothing beneath the gaps between their armor. Think of it as kind of like a jumpsuit that you'd wear actually before you get into like a vehicle of some sort, as pretty much what I'm imagining. So in order to create this detail, I decided to actually paint it out in 2 thin layers of pigment paint by Apple Barrel Paint. The black actually will contrast quite nicely with all the bright colors I plan on using on these miniatures. Plus, it gives kind of like this utilitarian air about what they're wearing. So I decided to put that on 2 thin layers of pigment paint for all the things like the arms, the chest, the legs, the gaps in the armor that you could actually see their jumpsuits in. And as you see from the front, there's actually quite a bit of that black showing through. And here's another picture from behind so that way you can see the back of them. As you can see, these jumpsuits are actually quite prevalent on the back portion of the hunting rigs. That's the reason why I decided to use this black color, because it's a nice contrasting color that contrasts nicely with all the colors that we used. And once we put our 2 thin layers of pigment paint, we're actually not going to dry brush it because you want to make that detail subdued. Next thing we're going to start working on is on the power armor. So we're going to do something a little bit differently this time when it comes to my miniatures, and the reason why is because I'm giving each one of these Spire Hunters a unique paint job for each one of them. After all, these guys are supposed to be individuals who are from noble houses, so they're going to spend their own money, making their hunting rigs look good. And like I said before, I wanted to create this metallic, colored metallic paint job with the miniatures, like their motorcycles or like their Transformers or something. It's got that high gloss metallic color with the colors that we're using. So to do that, to achieve that effect, what we're going to do is we're going to use glazing is what we're going to do. Now, if you wonder how glazing works, it's a pretty simple process. All you do is you take your colored paint and you water it down with some water till it's about the consistency of a wash, and you apply it like a wash all over the metal surface that you want it to be colored. Now, there's only one drawback with glazing. The drawback with the glazing is that you gotta wait multiple coats in order to achieve the end result that you want, which means you have to wait quite a bit for it to dry completely before you add another layer. You gotta let it dry again, then add another layer, like that. It's a very time-consuming and very tedious process, but as you can see in this photo, the end result looks absolutely fantastic. You can see that silver metallic color still kind of go through the glazing, so it makes it look like it's an actual colored piece of metal is what it looks like. So when we did our glazing for this one, it was actually pretty simple. What I decided to do is do with the main color for the suit, which I decided to use was Concord Gray by Appleboro Paint. Cost 50 cents at my local Walmart. Did that for all the arms, the chest, as well as for the legs. I then decided to pick up my accent colors. I decided to use a Crisp Apple by Appleboro Paint in order to do the shoulder as well as the ankle guards for the suits. That way I have some nice contrast with that purple. I then decided to use King's Gold by Appleboro Paint. Also cost 50 cents to pick out the things like the kneecaps, the knee armor joints, as well as the power talent and power fist this guy also has as well, putting 3 coats of that. And then finally the little power cells in the back of the rig, I decided to put 2 thin layers of ripe, 3 thin glazing layers of ripe tomato. And as you can see, it has a beautiful metallic look. It took a little while because we had to wait for the glaze to dry, but the results speak for themselves. So the next detail we got to work on are all the power cables around the Orrus Spyre Hunter. As you can see, we have some power cables along the neck as well as between the ribs leaning back to the power cells in the back. And I decided, because I want to make this color contrast nicely for the rest of the armor, I decided to use bright blue once again by Appleboro Paint in order to bring out that detail, so that way that eye-catching detail pops out at you, so that way you know that these power cells are there. We take exactly the same miniature and flip it around, and we do exactly the same thing. I'm using that bright blue paint, just 2 thin coats of it, and all the cabling that's on the back of the Orrus Spyre Hunter. Now, if you'll notice, we also have these sleeves that actually control and kind of bundle some of the cables in some cases. I thought it kind of looked like futuristic leather, so I decided to use some glaze with Anita's acrylic moccasin brown to kind of create like this kind of metallic wrap around those cables. And I put 3 bases of the glaze on top of that to kind of create this metallic brownish color on the armor, so it looks really fantastic, and I really like the way the end result looks. Continuing on the back of the miniature, I decided to pick out the little rivets of stitching on the leather sleeves. I picked out 2 thin layers of khaki brown. I didn't want to get those stitches to create that effect. And then I dry brushed the blue cabling with some sky blue by Appleboro Paint, so that way it gives a little bit of highlight to it and adds some visual interest to the miniature. Now that most of the miniature is done, we can start working on the finer details. For example, on the mask as well as the goggle lenses it has, we picked out 2 thin layers of kiwi on those lenses, so that way they look like they're glowing in the dark. At the same time, I also picked out some of the details in bright and Emperor's Gold by Deco Art, mainly the chest insignia that's on this chest of this guy. I picked out the entire thing in gold to make it look like it stands out from the rest of the Spyre Hunter's armor. And the last detail we captured are the sockets for the legs as well as the arms. Unfortunately for these Spyre Hunters, in order for them to actually operate their rigs, they usually have to chop off parts of their arms as well as their legs. They kind of dismember themselves, so that way they can fit cybernetic attachments into their armor. So in order to create that really grimdark look, I decided to pick out those sockets in copper by Folk Art. It contrasts nicely with the black as well as all the bright colors using on the armor as well. It makes it very distinct detail that you see right there on the legs. You can see where that guy has been basically cybernetically enhanced to add to their legs as well as to the arms. And once we're done with that feature, this particular Spyre Hunter is done and waiting on oil wash. So with the second Orrus Spyre Hunter, I'm once again going on the individual paint job for this guy. I decided to use some red colored accents for this character, and once again we're using glazing in order to achieve that metallic colored result. I decided to put 3 thin layers directly onto the face mask the guy is wearing, as well as his power fists, and as well as the kneecaps of his armor as well. I put 3 layers of glazing by Anita's Acrylic True Red. It costs about 65 cents at local Walmart. As you can see, it has this beautiful kind of metallic reddish color that looks really awesome. It also pops the rest of the miniature. Also, if you don't know if you guys can see this or not too, I also picked up the power cables in bright blue. It's exactly the same color I used for the other Orrus Spyre Hunter, so that way that detail will contrast nicely with the rest of the color schemes I'm planning on using. Alright, so now for the glazing that we did for this miniature. So once again, I wanted to make this guy primarily green, so I decided to use Chris Apple by Apple Barrel paint in order to achieve the same result. Once again, put about 3 layers of glaze on all the armor panels I wanted to be green. At the same time, I also did exactly the same thing with King's Gold as well. I put that directly onto the power cells on his shoulders, so that way it contrasts nicely. Now, if you'll notice, the power cable looks a little bit different. And the reason why is I realized I really don't want my two Orrus Spyre, my 2 Spyre Hunters to match anyway, because I want to make a look at their individual. So I decided to change the color. I decided to use True Teal by Apple Barrel Paint instead on the power cables, and I decided to pick those details out. And besides, our painting method is so cheap in terms of the materials that we're using, you can make mistakes like this and change your mind and still be saving money compared to the other brand. The last thing we decided to do, of course, is to pick out the metallic elements in Anita's acrylic aged copper. It has like a nice bronzy color to it. This time I decided to pick out the cabling on the top of the shoulder rig, as you can see in the Orrus Spyre Hunter, as well as their chest plate as well. Decided to pick that on 2 thin layers of that copper color to kind of create some contrast between the rest of the miniature. And as you can see from the back of the miniature, I decided to carry on that same motif. I'm using that crisp apple green for all the armor panels on the back, as well as same thing with King's Gold for the power cells. There's a better chance for you to look at that. And once again, I use that True Teal by Tornado's acrylic in order to pick out those power cabling couplings that we see in the back of the character. Now, when we're done with most of the miniature, we can start working on the finer details. So, for example, like the lenses on the face mask that the Orrus Spyre Hunter is wearing, I decided to pick down 2 thin layers of kiwi paint, putting a single dot on all those lenses and doing it twice, so that way it looks like it's glowing in the dark. And then once again, we go back to our metallic elements once again. I decided to once again do those little couplings for the arms as well as the legs to make it look like they've been cybernetically enhanced and placed in there. So because you picked out 2 thin layers of folk art copper in order to achieve that result. And the same thing with like the little bundling of metallic wrap around the cabling. I decided to do a glaze once again using Anita Acrylics True Moccasin Brown, which costs 65 cents at your local Walmart. And once I got that glazing look done, these miniatures are pretty much done. So now that we're done with all the details, next thing we gotta do, of course, is an oil wash. And once again, I use the same exact oil wash I used for my Curated Prime. I decided to use the Midwax Polyshade acrylic in Mission Oak, and I just did it once over with the wash all over the entirety of the miniature. As you can see, that oil wash does a beautiful job of doing a couple things. The first thing it does, of course, it mutes down the vibrancy of the colors that we use, so that way it looks more realistic. It has a really beautiful result as because of that. At the same time, the oil wash seeps into the recess of the miniatures, bringing out a lot of the details we couldn't see either. Things like gaps within the power armor, for example, the texturing of the fabric, the individual power coils, as well as power lines. It does a really beautiful job of doing this. And once again, we have to wait 24 hours for this stuff to dry and cure because it has polyurethane in it. And once it is done, the next thing we start working on are on the bases. So like I mentioned before, I've been really obsessed with making neon glowing bases for my miniatures. So in order to create this blue neon glow effect for these guys, I decided to paint the entirety of the base in 2 thin layers of Mystic Turquoise by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. As you can see, it's a nice dark teal color that does a really good job of actually muting down that base, because I really want to do a dry brush and make the glowing blue effect really pop on these miniatures as well. And once we're done with that, the next thing we gotta do, of course, is a dry brush. So once again, a dry brushing these miniatures in Folk Arts Dutch Aqua, exact same color we used for the Curated Prime. Just do a real quick once over the entirety of the miniature's base. And as you can see, we bring a lot of those textures we couldn't see before. So things like the actual individual armor panels, the decking that they're standing on, the individual vents that are on the miniature as well. We just do a real quick dry brushing with that. And the next thing we gotta do, of course, is a second dry brush. So in order to make it look like the bases have been weathered and worn over time, I decided to dry brush it real quick with some Anniversary Silver, make it look like the decking that they're walking upon has been scraped up by the elements and is really weathered and worn. So it kind of creates this kind of scratched metal kind of look, which looks really awesome as well. And the last thing we gotta do, of course, is to start putting in our coloring for the neon glow. Alright, so as you can see here, we decided to paint into the recess of the miniature to create this neon glowing blue effect. We used 2 colors in order to do this. We used 2 thin coats of Apple Barrel's bright blue, so that way we paint all the part of the recess of the miniatures of the bases that we might look like it has like a neon glowing blue color to it. And the reason why I did that is so that we have a good base coat in order to put our second color, which is neon blue by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents on top of that. I just put 2 thin layers of that color on top of the bright blue to kind of create this neon glowing blue effect that looks really awesome on the bases. And now that the bases are done, the last thing we gotta do, of course, is to paint the rim of the bases. So for my Curated Prime, as well as for my 2 Orrus Spyre Hunters, I use the exact same color, which is Folk Art Skyline. It's a beautiful grayish blue color that I use for all the Skimmers miniatures in the studio's collection. That just looks nice in my opinion. We put 2 thin layers around the bases, and we're pretty much done with the miniature. This last step is completely optional. However, I like a matte varnish on my miniatures, so I grab a can of Krylon matte spray. I give them the once over with that spray to kind of mute down the sheen of the polyurethane on the miniatures. It can have a nice matted finish to it, and voila, this is the end result that we actually have for your miniatures. As you can see, we brought these miniatures up to a beautiful tabletop standard with only using a minimum of cost in order to do so. Actually, when we total up our Cheapskate total, it actually ended up being $37.31 to buy all those materials that we use, assuming you're buying it for the first time in order to paint up your miniatures. So now that we're done talking about the Cheapskate method, let's talk about exactly what you'll need to buy from Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve the exact same results we did by using those name brand paints instead. Alright, so these are the materials that you need to buy from both Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using their products instead. You'll need to buy a can of Lead Belcher Spray, which is going to cost you $24, as well as Corix White Spray, which is going to cost you $17. You also need to buy the following colors: Thunderhawk Blue, Everland Sunset, Gene Sealer Purple, Teclis Blue, Blue Horror, Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone, Morghast Brown, Hellion Green, Moot Green, Slaanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Troll Slayer, Baja Roth Blue, Flayed One Flesh, Mephiston Red, XV88, and all those are going to cost you at $4.55 per pop. So that's actually quite expensive, as opposed to the 50 cents that I'm using for my apple barrel. After that, you'll need to buy some metallic paints, things like Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, and Ironbreaker, which are going to cost you $7.80 per those pots, as well as Rust Gray, which is going to cost you $4.55, Ulthuan Gray, which is also cost you another $4.55 on top of that. Aethermatic Blue as well as Croxicor Blue for your bases. It would cost you $7.80 for those color. Retributor Armors will also cost another $7.80 for the gold elements on your miniature. You also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32, and then you also need to buy a can of Munitorium Varnish for $19.50. So assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time in order to paint up your miniatures, you're talking about a grand total investment of $241.10 to paint up your miniatures the same way we did, but using the name brand paints from Citadel as well as Army Painter. When you compare that to our Cheapskate total, which is only $37.31, we end up saving you $203.79. So there you guys have it. That's how you guys can paint up your Orrus Spyre Hunters as well as a Caryatid Prime cheaply and quickly. So if you're strapped for cash and you're looking for ways in order to save money on the wargaming hobby, may I suggest switching to cheap craft paints. You can achieve very similar results at the same time with a fraction of the price. For example, the cheapest paint from Games Workshop is $4.55, while my paint, the cheapest, is 50 cents. In fact, it is so cheap that we actually made a mistake and a creative choice in this paint job, and we still save money because that's how cheap the paint I use really is. And of course, as you can see, beautiful tabletop standard, and I can't wait to see exactly how these guys operate on the tabletop. So that's good for those of you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. You guys' input is valuable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this week, guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.